My sister left her baby at my door and disappeared. My parents said that is your problem now. 10 years later, they sued me for custody, claiming I kept them apart. But when I gave the judge a sealed folder, his eyes widened. He asked, "Do they even know what you have?" I nodded and got ready to speak. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Zuri, 35 years old and a successful forensic accountant in Atlanta. I spend my career tracking dirty money and exposing financial fraud, but I never thought I would have to use those exact skills against my own flesh and blood. Growing up in my family meant watching my sister Jasmine get everything while I was expected to just exist in the background. But I built my own empire away from their toxicity. Everything exploded on the exact day of my son Malik turning 10 years old. I had rented out a private banquet room at an exclusive golf club where I am a premium member. The atmosphere was joyful. Malik was laughing with his friends and getting ready to cut his 3-tier birthday cake when the heavy oak doors of the hall suddenly burst open. A stranger in a black suit walked briskly past the tables straight toward me. He did not say a word, just coldly shoved a thick craft paper envelope into my hands. "Zuri Washington, you have been served." His voice echoed across the room, making all the guests fall completely silent. The music was abruptly cut off. At that exact moment, my biological sister Jasmine and her white husband Trent stormed in. Right behind them was a man carrying a large camera pointing the lens directly at my face. Jasmine rushed forward wearing an expensive designer silk dress and started wailing perfectly on cue. "Give me back my son, you kidnapper!" she screamed, putting on a flawless, tragic performance like a reality television star. "You stole my baby from me when I was at my absolute weakest." I did not flinch. In my line of work, panic is a sign of guilt, and I had absolutely nothing to hide. I took a step forward, shielding Malik behind me. My hand gripped the boy's shoulder tightly to give him reassurance. He looked at me confused, but not scared, because I raised him to be a warrior. I stared straight into the camera lens with the coldest look possible. Before I could even speak, the doors opened again. This time, my biological parents walked in. They marched straight over and stood right next to Jasmine, showing absolute support for their golden child. My father snatched the microphone from the party host. "You stole that boy 10 years ago when your sister was suffering from severe postpartum depression." He announced loudly over the club sound system, smearing my name in front of dozens of my close friends and colleagues. "Now that she and her husband are wealthy and stable, how much longer are you going to keep our family flesh and blood away from us?" His blatant lies made me sick to my stomach. 10 years ago, Jasmine dumped a feverish baby at my door so she could fly to Europe with Trent, because that man did not want a black child ruining his upper-class aesthetic. My entire family abandoned me to handle the hospital bills and diapers alone. Yet here they were standing in front of me playing the poor victims. Trent stepped forward, adjusting the lapels of his expensive custom suit. He smirked, looking me up and down with absolute contempt. It was that familiar condescending look I always got from fake elites. "You are just a busy single woman working 80 hours a week." He judged loudly for everyone to hear. "Malik needs a civilized environment, a private school education, and a complete family, not to be stuck with a bitter old woman." His insult reached its peak, but I only smiled. I did not scream or cry or try to explain myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. I simply snapped my fingers and signaled the club security team. Immediately, 4 large guards entered the hall. "Remove all these people from the premises for trespassing," I ordered calmly and firmly. Before Trent could turn away, I stepped closer and whispered right into his ear. "A civilized environment, huh? I really hope your credit card does not get declined when you try to pay for parking today, Trent." His arrogant face instantly dropped. He stared at me in absolute shock as the security guards dragged his entire family out of the hall. The camera was forced off. Jasmine's screaming faded down the hallway. They thought they had the upper hand using public pressure to intimidate me. But they had no idea that as a forensic accountant, I had already accessed the public financial records and knew every dirty little secret hiding in their bank accounts. They wanted to play a shallow media game, but I was about to play a legal game of total destruction. This war had just begun, and I was not going to leave them a single way out. The heavy oak doors of the banquet hall slammed shut behind them, but the damage to the evening was already done. I knelt down to Malik, smoothing his customized birthday suit, and told him to go eat some cake with his friends while I handled the adults. My hands were perfectly steady, but inside a cold fury was taking root. After ensuring the kids were distracted by the entertainer, I stepped out into the grand lobby of the country club to instruct the valet to bring my car around. I wanted to be prepared to leave the moment the party wrapped up. But they had not left. My biological parents, Clarence and Vivian, were standing furiously by the marble pillars near the valet stand, refusing to move. Jasmine and Trent were nowhere to be seen, likely already fleeing the humiliation, but my parents had stayed behind to do what they always did best, which was to protect Jasmine at all costs and tear me down in the process. As soon as the valet doors slid open, my mother Vivian marched toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "How dare you embarrass your sister like that in front of those people?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "She is a Kensington now, Zuri. She has a reputation to uphold in this city, and you are acting like a bitter, jealous spinster." I crossed my arms and looked down at the woman who had birthed me, but never actually mothered me. Jealous of what exactly, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. My father Clarence stepped up right beside her, his chest puffed out in that aggressive way he used whenever he wanted to intimidate me into submission. "You know exactly what your mother means," he barked loudly, not caring that the valet staff was watching. "You have always been envious of Jasmine. From the time you were little, you hated that she was the pretty one, the sociable one, the one who married into a prominent family. You could never stand seeing her succeed. So when she hit a rough patch, you saw your chance to steal the only thing that could ruin her perfect life. You stole her child, just to punish her." His words hung in the air, dripping with the delusional reality they had constructed. A rough patch. That is what he called it. I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his statement wash over me. 10 years ago, that rough patch meant Jasmine showing up at my apartment at 2 in the morning, smelling like expensive gin and cheap decisions. She shoved an 8-month-old Malik into my arms. He was burning up with a 104-degree fever, wearing a soiled diaper that had caused a severe skin infection. She told me she needed a break because Trent, her brand-new wealthy boyfriend, could not handle the stress of a crying baby. Then she got on a first-class flight to Milan. I spent 3 nights sleeping in a hard plastic chair at the pediatric emergency room, praying my nephew would not go into seizures. When I called my parents begging for help with the hospital bills, my mother told me not to bother them because they were busy planning an engagement party for Jasmine and Trent. They told me the baby was my problem now. For a decade, Malik did not exist to them because a dark-skinned child from a previous relationship did not fit the aesthetic of their new elite white in-laws. They wanted proximity to whiteness and old money so badly, they threw their own grandson away like trash. And now they were standing in the lobby of my country club, calling me a kidnapper. "You are both delusional," I said, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of the emotional reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. "Jasmine abandoned her son. You both abandoned him. For 10 years I have been his mother, his father, his provider, and his protector. I paid for his braces, his private school, his asthma medications, and his summer camps. Where was all this family pride when I was working 80-hour weeks to put food on the table?" My mother scoffed, rolling her eyes defensively. "We knew you could handle it, Zuri. You were always the tough one, the workaholic. Jasmine is fragile. She needs a soft life, and now she finally has it. She has the big house, the cars, and the status. She represents our family's success in this city. She is ready to be a mother now, and Trent is willing to accept the boy. You need to stop being selfish and return him to his rightful place. Do not destroy your sister just because you cannot find a man to build a family with." The sheer audacity of her statement was almost impressive. They genuinely believed that Malik was just an accessory, a designer handbag that Jasmine could put in storage and reclaim whenever it suited her aesthetic. They thought my life, my career, my sacrifices meant absolutely nothing compared to Jasmine playing house. There is no rightful place for Malik, with people who view him as an inconvenience, I replied, my gaze locking onto my father. And as for Trent being willing to accept him, you might want to ask your golden son-in-law why he is suddenly so interested in a child he refused to acknowledge for a decade. Do you really think a man like Trent just woke up one morning with a bleeding heart? My father narrowed his eyes, his confidence faltering for just a fraction of a second. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice dropping an octave. Trent comes from a legacy family. He has more money than you will ever see in your lifetime. I smiled, a cold, practiced smile that I usually reserved for hostile witnesses in a deposition. I am saying that you should look closer at the empire you are so proud of, I said, stepping past them as the valet pulled my Mercedes up to the curb. You might want to ask Trent why his credit lines are suddenly freezing up and why Jasmine is selling her designer bags on consignment. Jasmine is not ready to be a mother. She is just desperate. And you two are as blind as ever. If you ever come near my son again or show up at my private events, I will not just call security. I will have you arrested for harassment. I did not wait for their response. I walked through the glass doors, tipped the valet, and got into my car. My phone was already buzzing with notifications. Jasmine had apparently wasted no time. While my parents were trying to intimidate me in the lobby, she had already taken the war to social media. As I glanced at my screen, I saw her face covered in fake tears on a live broadcast that already had thousands of viewers. The smear campaign had officially started, but I just smiled, putting the car in drive. They were digging their own graves, and I was more than happy to hand them the shovels. The drive back to my house in Buckhead was eerily quiet. I glanced in the rearview mirror to see Malik fast asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional whiplash of his ruined birthday party. I turned off the main road and approached the private gates of my neighborhood. That was when my headlights washed over a sleek silver Range Rover parked illegally across my driveway entrance. Standing right in front of the iron gates illuminated by the harsh security lights was Trent. He had clearly rushed over here while my parents were busy delaying me at the country club lobby. I put the car in park, keeping the engine running, and stepped out. I made sure to lock the doors behind me, keeping Malik safe inside the vehicle. Trent did not look like a man who had just been thrown out of a venue. Instead, he looked entirely too comfortable. He slowly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored Tom Ford suit, running a hand over the expensive fabric with a profound sense of entitlement. He looked at me not with anger, but with that deep-seated paternalistic pity that arrogant white men reserve for black women who refuse to stay in their place. Look, Zuri. He began, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial diplomacy. I know you are upset, but let us look at this logically. You have done a passable job keeping the boy alive, but you and I both know this arrangement is no longer sustainable. He took a step closer, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. You are a single black woman working 80 hours a week hunting down tax evaders. That is not a proper environment for a young boy. Malik is getting older. He needs to be educated in a complete and civilized family. He needs structure and a father figure. He needs the Kensington name. I stood completely still, letting the sheer audacity of his words hang in the humid Atlanta night air. A civilized family. That was his coded language. It was the ultimate microaggression wrapped in a tailored suit. He was implying that my home, despite being paid for in full by my own sweat and intellect, was somehow lacking because it lacked a white patriarch. He was implying that the private academy I paid for was not enough unless Malik had the proximity to whiteness that Trent supposedly provided. Trent mistook my silence for submission. He smirked, leaning casually against the hood of my Mercedes. Let us be brutally honest, Zuri. Jasmine is his biological mother. She can give him the aesthetic of a traditional family. She can get him into the right yacht clubs, the right prep schools, The right circles in Charleston. Places where your money, no matter how much you hustle, will never truly buy you a seat at the table. You are holding him back because of your own stubborn pride. Hand him over quietly, and I will make sure you get visitation rights on major holidays. If you fight us in court, I will use every connection my family has to drag your name through the mud. By the time my lawyers are done portraying you as an angry, bitter spinster, no accounting firm in this state will ever hire you again. The humiliation he was trying to inflict was designed to break my spirit. He wanted me to feel small, inadequate, and terrified of his supposed old money power. But what Trent did not know was that while he was busy adjusting his Tom Ford suit, my trained forensic eyes were already dismantling his facade. I noticed that the registration sticker on his Range Rover was expired. I noticed that the sole of his Italian leather shoe was worn down in a way that suggested it had not been replaced in years. Real wealth does not neglect the details. Only people drowning in debt let the small things slip. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. You talk a lot about civilization, Trent. But there is nothing civilized about a man who throws a sick infant away like garbage only to suddenly demand him back 10 years later. I took a step forward, forcing him to stand up straight. You think your skin color and your last name give you the authority to dictate my son's future? You think you can intimidate me with threats of lawyers and country club connections? But you are standing in front of my house, blocking my driveway and demanding a child you do not even know. Move your car before I have it towed and impounded. Trent's face flushed a deep, angry red. The polite mask slipped completely, revealing the viciousness underneath. You are making a massive mistake, you arrogant bitch, he spat out entirely, dropping his refined vocabulary. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I will take that kid, and I will ruin you in the process. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the Community Security Patrol, keeping my eyes locked on his. I know exactly who I am dealing with, Trent, and very soon you will realize that you picked the wrong woman to threaten. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. Trent cursed under his breath, turning on his heel and storming back to his vehicle. He slammed the door and sped off into the night, his tires screeching against the asphalt. I watched his taillights disappear into the darkness. He thought he had delivered the ultimate threat, but all he had done was confirm everything I suspected. They were desperate, and desperate people always leave a paper trail. The morning after Trent tried to ambush me in my own driveway, I arrived at my accounting firm in downtown Atlanta. My office occupied the top 3 floors of a premier glass skyscraper, and as a senior partner, I commanded absolute authority within those walls. I walked through the revolving glass doors, holding my briefcase, feeling ready to dive into the financial records I had pulled late last night. But as soon as I stepped into the grand marble lobby, I stopped dead in my tracks. Sitting on the leather visitor couches, acting as if they owned the building, were Jasmine and Trent. Next to them was a man holding a sleek leather briefcase, clearly a lawyer. They had come to my workplace to ambush me, hoping to use public pressure and professional embarrassment to force my hand. As soon as Jasmine spotted me, she jumped up from the couch. "Zuri, we are not leaving until you sign the temporary custody transfer," she announced loudly, ensuring her voice echoed across the busy lobby. Several junior associates and administrative staff turned their heads to look at us. She was wearing a perfectly tailored white dress, playing the role of the distressed, desperate mother. "We brought our attorney. You can either handle this quietly right now, or we will make sure your entire firm knows that you kidnapped your own nephew." Trent stepped forward, buttoning his suit jacket with that familiar, arrogant smirk. He thought he had me cornered. "We are giving you a chance to do the right thing before we drag you through a lengthy court battle," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You have a reputation to maintain here, Zuri. It would be a shame if your partners found out how unstable your personal life really is. Hand the boy over, and we will walk away quietly." Any other person might have crumbled under the weight of that public threat. They expected me to scream, to cry, or to desperately drag them into a private conference room to protect my professional image. But I did not do any of that. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not explain myself to the onlookers. I simply looked at them with complete indifference. I walked past Jasmine, entirely ignoring her existence, and went straight to the main security desk. The head of building security, a former Marine, immediately stood up when he saw me. "Good morning, Miss Washington," he said respectfully. "Good morning," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "These three individuals are trespassing. They do not have an appointment, and they are harassing a senior partner. Please have them escorted off the premises immediately. If they resist, call the Atlanta police and press formal charges for criminal trespass." Jasmine turned pale. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, dropping her composed mother act. "We are your family." The security guards did not care about her family status. Four large men in uniform immediately surrounded them, instructing them to walk toward the exit. The lawyer, knowing better than to risk his own license, quickly packed up his briefcase and walked out without saying a single word. Jasmine began to loudly protest, but the guards firmly guided her toward the revolving doors. Trent, however, tried to stand his ground. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his white privilege to intimidate the security team. "Do not touch me. I am leaving," he snapped violently, brushing the hand of a guard off his shoulder. As he walked past me, glaring with pure hatred, I took one step forward and invaded his personal space. I leaned in so close that only he could hear my voice over the commotion. "A civilized environment, huh?" I whispered, repeating the exact words he had used against me the night before. "I ran a preliminary trace on your public assets this morning, Trent. I really hope your American Express card does not get declined when you try to pay for parking today." Trent completely froze. His entire body went rigid, and the arrogant smirk was instantly wiped from his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking physically sick. He stared at me, his eyes wide with sudden terror. He knew exactly what I meant. He knew that I knew. His elite, wealthy facade was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and in that one terrifying second, he realized that I was already holding the match to burn it all down. Before he could formulate a single word, the security guards grabbed him by the arms and shoved him out through the glass doors. I stood in the lobby, watching them get humiliated in front of my entire staff. The audience of junior accountants and receptionists was buzzing with curiosity, but no one dared to ask me a single question. I simply smoothed out the front of my blazer, picked up my coffee, and stepped into the private executive elevator. The first counterattack had been executed flawlessly. They tried to use power and status to break me, but they forgot that I was the one who actually built my own power. Now that they knew I was looking into their finances, I knew they would panic. And when arrogant people panic, they make catastrophic mistakes. By the time I reached my corner office on the top floor, I thought the worst of the morning was over. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat behind my mahogany desk, ready to dissect the financial records I had pulled on Trent. But my phone started buzzing. Not just a few texts, but an absolute avalanche of notifications. My screen lit up with tags, direct messages, and missed calls. I opened Instagram, and there it was. Jasmine had gone live, sitting in her designer car parked right outside my office building. Her makeup was perfectly smudged to look like she had been crying for hours. She was staring into the camera, putting on the performance of a lifetime. The viewer count at the top of the screen was skyrocketing, already crossing the 2 million mark. "I am just a mother trying to get my baby back," she sobbed, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. 10 years ago, I was suffering from severe postpartum depression. I was young and I was breaking down. My sister Zuri took my son Malik under the guise of helping me, but she never gave him back. Now she is a wealthy corporate executive using her money and lawyers to keep my flesh and blood away from me. She just had me thrown out of her building like a dog when all I wanted was to hug my son. Please share this video. Help a mother reunite with her child. The comments scrolling beneath her video were vicious. Thousands of strangers who knew absolutely nothing about the nights I spent in emergency rooms or the thousands of dollars I paid for Malik private tuition were suddenly experts on my life. They called me a bitter spinster, a kidnapper, a corporate sellout who hated her own family. Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing. She was weaponizing the internet, using the very real pain of maternal struggles to mask her own 10-year abandonment. She was painting me as the villain in a narrative she had carefully curated for maximum viral sympathy. Before I could even process the sheer volume of the cyberbullying, my office phone rang. It was Mr. Sterling, the senior managing partner of the firm. He did not ask how I was doing. He just told me to come to his office immediately. When I walked in, Mr. Sterling was standing by the window looking deeply stressed. His computer screen was open to Jasmine viral video. The firm public relations team was already on a conference call on his speakerphone. "Zuri, sit down," he said, pointing to the leather chair across from him. "This is a public relations nightmare. Our firm handles highly sensitive forensic accounting for Fortune 500 companies and federal agencies. Our clients demand absolute discretion and unimpeachable integrity. Right now, our firm is being tagged in thousands of comments calling one of our top partners a child abductor." I kept my posture completely straight. "Mr. Sterling, that video is a fabricated manipulation. Jasmine abandoned that child a decade ago because her wealthy husband did not want him. I am in the middle of a legal dispute because they suddenly want access to a trust fund they have no right to. I have the documentation to prove all of this." "I believe you, Zuri." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You are the sharpest accountant in this building. But the court of public opinion does not care about documentation. They care about optics. We are getting calls from clients asking why our firm is trending on social media for all the wrong reasons. The board has made a decision. We need you to take an immediate leave of absence." The words hit the room like a heavy weight. A leave of absence. They were benching me. My career was the one thing I had built entirely on my own, away from the toxic shadow of my family. It was my sanctuary, and now Jasmine had managed to poison that too. "It is with full pay," Mr. Sterling added quickly, seeing the coldness in my eyes. "Just take a few weeks off, settle this family dispute, clear your name in court. Once the internet moves on to the next scandal, you can come right back to your desk. But right now, your presence here is a liability to the firm." I could have argued. I could have pointed out the millions of dollars in revenue I brought to this company. But I knew how corporate America worked. When the spotlight gets too hot, they cut the cord to protect the brand. And honestly, arguing would only make me look exactly like the angry black woman Jasmine was portraying me to be. I stood up, buttoning my blazer. "I understand, Mr. Sterling. I will have my current caseload transferred to the junior partners by noon. But mark my words, when I come back, this scandal will not just be cleared, it will be completely incinerated." I walked back to my office, packed my laptop, and ignored the staring eyes of my colleagues as I headed to the elevator. Jasmine and my parents probably thought this was their ultimate victory. They thought taking away my job would break me financially and emotionally. They thought they had backed me into a corner. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. By forcing me onto administrative leave, they had just given a highly motivated forensic accountant 40 extra hours a week of completely uninterrupted free time. I no longer had corporate meetings or client consultations to distract me. I could now dedicate every waking second to tearing apart Trent Kensington financial life piece by microscopic piece. My phone buzzed again. It was a calendar reminder. The mandatory family mediation session was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Jasmine and my parents thought they were walking into that room with all the leverage in the world. They thought the internet had given them the upper hand. I smiled, stepping into the elevator. They were about to learn that social media clout means absolutely nothing when you are sitting across from someone holding your actual bank statements. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the downtown Family Mediation Center was suffocating. I sat on one side of a long mahogany conference table, perfectly composed in a tailored charcoal suit. Across from me sat Jasmine Trent, their high-priced attorney, and my mother Vivian. The court-appointed mediator, an older woman with tired eyes, sat at the head of the table. She looked like she had seen every type of family dysfunction, but she had no idea what was about to unfold. Jasmine lawyer wasted absolutely no time. He opened a thick leather briefcase and dramatically spread a series of glossy 8 by 10 photographs across the table. They were surveillance-style pictures of me leaving my office building. "Look at the timestamps," he said, his voice dripping with rehearsed outrage. 11 at night, midnight, sometimes even 2 in the morning. Miss Washington claims to be a devoted caregiver, but these photos prove she is married to her corporate job. She is an absentee guardian who prioritizes her ambition over the well-being of a 10-year-old boy. My client Jasmine is a stay-at-home mother who can offer Malik the full-time nurturing environment he so desperately needs. I looked down at the photos. They had actually hired a private investigator to follow me. It was a pathetic attempt to weaponize my success against me. I did not interrupt. I simply clicked my pen and began taking detailed notes on a yellow legal pad. My lack of an emotional reaction seemed to irritate them because that was when my mother decided to intervene. Vivian leaned forward, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. She looked directly at the mediator, putting on her best concerned grandmother face. "You have to understand something about my daughters." She began, her tone patronizing and sweet. "Zuri has always struggled. She has always been the difficult one. Growing up, she was deeply envious of Jasmine. Jasmine was always the beautiful one, the social butterfly, the one who naturally attracted people. Zuri buried herself in books and numbers because she could never compete with her sister socially." I kept my eyes on my notepad, my pen moving smoothly across the paper. My mother was rewriting history right in front of me, reducing my hard-earned intellect to nothing more than a byproduct of jealousy. When Jasmine met Trent, Vivian continued gesturing proudly toward her wealthy white son-in-law. It pushed Zuri over the edge. "Trent comes from an incredible family. He gave Jasmine the perfect life, the perfect marriage, the perfect home." Zuri could not stand it. She is 35 years old and completely alone. She has no husband and no prospects. So when Jasmine had a brief moment of vulnerability 10 years ago, Zuri pounced. She took Malik not because she loves him, but because she wanted to steal a piece of Jasmine's life. She wanted to punish her sister for having the fairy tale that Zuri knows she will never get. She is using my grandson as a prop to fill the empty void in her own life. The sheer level of delusion in that room was astounding. Vivian was sitting there under oath in a legal proceeding, swearing that I essentially kidnapped a child out of romantic jealousy. They were trying to paint me as a bitter, angry black woman who hated her light-skinned sister and her elite white husband. Trent sat next to Jasmine, looking incredibly smug. He clearly loved hearing my mother stroke his ego and validate his superiority. Jasmine was dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the traumatized victim who had her baby snatched away by a cruel spinster. The mediator turned to me, waiting for the inevitable explosion. She expected me to start screaming to defend my honor or to hurl insults back at my family. In family court mediation, the party who loses their temper first usually loses the room. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not deal in emotions, I deal in facts. And the facts were currently locked securely in a sealed folder in my briefcase. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I finished writing my sentence, placed my pen down, and looked directly at my mother. My face was completely devoid of emotion, an impenetrable wall of ice. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice quiet, but cutting through the room like a blade. Vivian blinked, clearly unsettled by my calm demeanor. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jasmine Lawyer quickly put a hand on her arm, sensing the subtle shift in power. "If we are done with the character assassinations and the amateur psychology," I continued, leaning back in my chair, "I have a few practical questions regarding this proposed transition. Since Jasmine and Trent are so deeply committed to providing Malik with this perfect nurturing environment, I assume we need to discuss the financial logistics of his care." Jasmine and Trent exchanged a quick, confused look. They had braced themselves for a screaming match. They had prepared for me to fight tooth and nail to keep Malik. They never expected me to calmly pivot to the financial aspects of raising him. They thought they had successfully bullied me into submission. But they did not realize I was just laying out the bait for my trap, and they were about to walk right into it. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a neatly stapled stack of financial spreadsheets. I handed the first copy to the mediator, then slid the remaining copies across the mahogany table toward Jasmine Trent and their high-priced attorney. My mother craned her neck, trying to see what was on the paper. Since you are so eager to take over as Malik primary caregivers, I assume you want to maintain the standard of living I have provided for him over the last 10 years, I said, keeping my voice entirely professional and devoid of any sarcasm. As you know, raising a boy in a civilized and elite environment is not a cheap endeavor. Jasmine lawyer adjusted his glasses and looked down at the numbers. Jasmine and Trent leaned in closely. I watched with quiet satisfaction as their eyes darted across the itemized list and their initial arrogance slowly evaporated. I decided to walk them through the numbers, just to make sure they fully understood the reality of the situation. Malik currently attends an elite private preparatory academy here in Atlanta. Tuition alone is $2,500 a month. He also suffers from severe asthma, which requires a specialized daily inhaler and regular visits to a top-tier pediatric pulmonologist. That adds another $800 a month out of pocket. Then there is his advanced coding camp, his martial arts classes, his organic meal plan clothing, and general living expenses. The absolute minimum total comes out to just over $5,000 a month. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked directly into Trent's eyes. I assume a man of your profound wealth and legacy will have no problem absorbing these costs effective immediately. After all, you made it very clear last night that my home and my resources were inadequate. I expect you will not be asking the inadequate working-class spinster for any child support. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. Trent's face turned a blotchy shade of crimson. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously. $5,000 a month of extra disposable income was not pocket change for someone who was secretly drowning in $12 million of hidden debt. I saw his hand tremble slightly against the table before he quickly snatched it back and hid it in his lap. Jasmine looked like she was going to throw up right there in the mediation room. She stared at the bold total number at the bottom of the page and then looked at her husband with sheer panic in her eyes. They had wanted the aesthetic of a child, but they had entirely forgotten about the actual cost of keeping one alive. They were already struggling to keep their luxury cars from being repossessed. Taking on a $5,000 monthly expense would push them into immediate bankruptcy. My mother Vivian, entirely oblivious to the financial ruin hiding behind Trent's designer suit, proudly chimed in. "Oh, do not worry about that, Zuri. Trent is a very successful investor. $5,000 a month is nothing to them. They can give Malik the best of everything." I watched Trent's jaw clench so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. My mother was completely digging his grave for him, and he could not say a single word to stop her. Their lawyer, also completely oblivious to his client's actual financial reality, nodded approvingly. "My clients are more than capable of handling these standard expenses, Miss Washington. They simply want their son back in his rightful home. They are fully prepared to take over the financial burden." "Is that correct, Trent?" Trent was completely trapped. He could not admit he was broke in front of the mediator. He could not admit he was a fraud in front of his expensive attorney or his adoring mother-in-law. He could not admit that his old money aesthetic was entirely funded by credit card kiting and stolen pension funds. His toxic pride and his fragile white ego simply would not allow him to back down in front of a black woman he viewed as inferior. He forced a tight, strained smile that did not reach his eyes. "Of course," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "We are fully prepared to take on all of Malik's financial needs. He will not need a single dime from you, Zuri." Jasmine quickly nodded along, though her voice was shaking visibly. "Yes, we have plenty of money. We just want him home with us where he belongs." I smiled. It was a genuine, deeply satisfying smile. Beneath the table, the discreet voice recording application on my smartwatch was silently capturing every single spoken word. They had just legally and verbally committed to a massive financial burden they could not possibly afford, strictly out of arrogance and greed. They thought they were winning the negotiation by calling my bluff, but they had just locked themselves into a financial death spiral. Excellent, I said smoothly, picking up my pen. I am so glad we are on the exact same page regarding the money. It takes a lot of pressure off my shoulders to know my nephew will be so well funded by his new family. Jasmine let out a breath she had been holding, thinking she had just successfully passed a major hurdle. She thought I was actually yielding to their demands. She thought the hardest part of the mediation was over. But she had no idea that I was just making sure they were fully committed before I dragged them into the real reason they had come here today. The mediation session concluded with the court-appointed mediator praising our supposed breakthrough. She genuinely believed we had made progress because we agreed on the financial figures. My mother Vivian hugged Jasmine, whispering words of encouragement, while Trent shook his attorney hand, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I quietly packed my spreadsheets back into my briefcase and exited the suite before any of them could try to engage me in small talk. I took the elevator down to the underground parking garage, wanting to put as much distance between myself and their toxic delusion as possible. The air in the subterranean level was damp and smelled heavily of exhaust fumes. The concrete pillars cast long, dark shadows across the designated parking spots. This particular sublevel of the building was notoriously lacking in security cameras, which was exactly why I usually avoided parking here. But today, it served a very specific purpose. As I approached my Mercedes, I heard the sharp, aggressive clicking of stilettos echoing rapidly behind me. I did not even have to turn around to know who was following me. "Zuri, wait right there." Jasmine's voice bounced off the concrete walls, but this time the trembling victim act was completely gone. Her tone was harsh, demanding, and entirely stripped of all the fake maternal warmth she had just displayed upstairs in front of the mediator. I unlocked my car, but kept my hand resting on the door handle, finally turning to face her. She marched right up to me, her expensive designer bag swinging wildly at her side. Her eyes were narrowed, her posture stiff and combative. Trent was nowhere in sight, probably waiting in the lobby to maintain his pristine, aristocratic image, while his wife did the dirty work in the shadows. "Cut the crap," Zuri, Jasmine hissed, stopping just a few feet away from my car. "We both know you do not actually care about paying for those ridiculous prep school fees and organic meal plans. You are just trying to stall, but it is not going to work. I know the real truth." I looked at her blankly, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "What truth exactly, Jasmine?" She let out a harsh, bitter laugh, crossing her arms over her chest. "Do not play stupid with me. I know about Marcus. I know he died last month in a car accident in Houston. And more importantly, I know exactly what that bastard left behind." Her words hung in the stale garage air. 10 years ago, Jasmine treated Marcus like absolute garbage. He was Malik's biological father, a struggling software developer with massive ambitions, but $0 in his bank account. Jasmine constantly berated him for not being able to buy her luxury items. Eventually, she dumped his sick infant son on my porch and ran off to find Trent, a wealthy white man who could instantly provide the country club lifestyle she felt entitled to. What Jasmine did not anticipate was that Marcus would eventually launch a tech startup, sell it to a major corporate conglomerate, and build a quiet, massive fortune while she was busy playing a trophy wife in Charleston. I got a certified letter from the probate attorneys in Texas 3 days ago. Jasmine continued, her eyes practically gleaming with unrestrained greed. "Marcus left a trust fund. $18 million, Zuri. 18 million. And it all goes directly to Malik. Since I am his biological mother, I have the legal right to manage those assets until he is 25 years old. That is my money. I birthed him. I endured the stretch marks and the ruined body. I deserve that payout after everything I have been through." I stood perfectly still, letting the absolute depravity of her words wash over me. She had just freely confessed that this entire custody battle, the viral social media videos, the fake tears, the character assassination, and the sudden desire to be a mother had absolutely nothing to do with loving her son. It was a calculated cash grab. She was trying to monetize the child she had thrown away a decade ago. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were suddenly business partners. Trent and I need that capital right now. We have some major investments tied up, and we need immediate liquidity to secure our assets. So here's the deal. You sign the permanent custody transfer by Friday and drop this whole devoted aunt routine. Once the family court grants me full control of the trust fund, I will cut you a check for 10%. $1.8 million, Zuri. That is more than enough to compensate you for playing babysitter for the last 10 years. You can take that money, buy yourself some more ugly business suits, and leave us alone. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to jump at the offer. She honestly believed that everyone in the world was as shallow and financially motivated as she was. She thought she could buy my silence and my son with a fraction of his own inheritance. I did not get angry. I did not yell. Instead, I let a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I raised my left wrist and deliberately tapped the screen of my smartwatch. The tiny red recording icon was blinking brightly in the dim light of the parking garage. I saw Jasmine's eyes dart down to my wrist, and the smug, arrogant confidence instantly drained from her face. 10%, I asked, my voice echoing chillingly against the concrete. Is that how cheap you price your own flesh and blood, Jasmine? You are willing to sell your maternal love and uproot a 10-year-old boy life for a 10% cut of a dead man money. You bitch, she spat, taking a panicked step back. You cannot record me without my consent. This is a two-party consent state. My lawyer will have you thrown in jail for wiretapping. I chuckled, shaking my head as I opened my car door. We are in a public parking garage, Jasmine. There is no reasonable expectation of privacy here. Any first-year law student could tell you that. But do not worry, I am not going to send this audio file to the police. I am going to play it in open family court. I am going to let the judge hear exactly why the grieving, heartbroken mother suddenly wants her long-lost son back. Jasmine's face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. The polished elite facade completely shattered. She lunged forward as if she was going to grab my arm or smash my watch, but I leveled a glare at her so lethal she froze dead in her tracks. You think you are so smart, Zuri, she screamed, losing all remaining control. You think a little audio clip is going to stop Trent. You have no idea what his family can do. We will bury you. We will make sure you never work in this city again. I tossed my briefcase onto the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel. Bring a shovel, Jasmine, I said smoothly. Because from what I have seen of your husband's bank accounts, he cannot even afford the dirt. I slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off her frantic screaming. I started the engine and backed out of the parking space, leaving her standing alone in the dark garage fumes. As I drove up the concrete ramp and out into the bright Atlanta sunlight, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The first domino had officially fallen. Jasmine had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her victim narrative. Now it was time to let them push their luck even further, because the higher they climbed, the harder they were going to fall. The very next afternoon, I was sitting at my home office desk, diving deep into the offshore shell companies I had linked to Trent. My computer monitors were glowing with bank statements and tax filings when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Malik Private Preparatory School. A call from the headmaster office in the middle of the school day was never a good sign. I answered immediately. Miss Washington, the headmaster said, his voice tight with anxiety. We have a situation at the student pickup line. Your parents, Clarence and Vivian, showed up demanding to take Malik home. They bypassed the visitor checkpoint and tried to physically pull him into their vehicle. My blood ran ice cold. Are they still there? I asked, already grabbing my car keys and my blazer. Is Malik safe? Malik is perfectly safe, the headmaster assured me. You have raised an incredibly sharp young man. When your father grabbed his backpack, Malik immediately dropped his weight to the ground and shouted for the campus armed security. The officers intervened immediately. Because your parents became combative and refused to leave the premises, we had to involve the Atlanta Police Department. They are currently being held at the precinct down the street from the school. I am on my way, I said, and hung up. I drove to the police precinct, breaking every speed limit on the way. My parents had crossed an unforgivable line. They had gone from playing manipulative mind games in mediation rooms to attempting to physically abduct my son in broad daylight. They were getting desperate because they knew the legal route would take too long, and Trent needed that trust fund money right now. When I walked through the double doors of the precinct, the first thing I saw was Malik. He was sitting on a bench behind the front desk, drinking a juice box, and talking calmly to a female police officer. He looked up and gave me a small, reassuring wave. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me, but it was instantly replaced by a burning, consuming rage. Across the lobby, sitting in hard plastic chairs, were Clarence and Vivian. They did not look like concerned grandparents. They looked like furious, entitled narcissists who were highly offended that the law applied to them. My mother was aggressively tapping her foot, while my father was yelling at a desk sergeant. "We are his biological grandparents." Clarence bellowed, his face red with indignation. "We have every right to pick him up from school. Our daughter is his real mother. You are treating us like common criminals when we are a respected family in this community." The desk sergeant looked completely unimpressed. "Sir, you are not on the authorized pickup list. You bypassed private school security and grabbed a child who actively resisted you. You are lucky the school is declining to press kidnapping charges at this exact moment." I walked straight up to my parents, my heels clicking loudly against the linoleum floor. They stopped arguing with the officer and turned to face me. Vivian immediately stood up, pointing an accusing finger at my face. "Zuri, tell these officers to release us right now," she demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "You have poisoned that boy's mind." He looked right at us, his own flesh and blood, and screamed for a security guard like we were strangers. "This is your fault. You are turning him against his real family." I stepped so close to my mother that she was forced to step back and bump into her plastic chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that echoed clearly across the quiet police lobby. "You are strangers to him, Vivian," I said. "You have not seen him in 10 years. You do not know his favorite color, his allergies, or the names of his friends. You showed up at his school to forcefully drag him into your car because your golden daughter told you to. You terrified a 10-year-old boy because you care more about Jasmine's bank account than you care about his safety." Clarence puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, just like he did when I was a teenager. "Now you listen here, Zuri," he growled, stepping forward. "We are trying to fix this family. Trent and Jasmine need the boy now. We are not going to let you keep playing these games." I did not back down. I held my ground and stared directly into my father's eyes, stripping away every ounce of respect I ever had for him. "Let me make this perfectly clear to both of you," I said, enunciating every single word so the police officers around us could hear exactly what I was saying. "You have no legal rights to that child. You are not on his emergency contact list. You are not his guardians. If you ever show up at his school, his summer camp, or anywhere near my house again, I will not just let the security guards handle it. I will press federal kidnapping charges. I will ruin whatever fake community reputation you think you have left, and I will personally see to it that you both spend your retirement in a state penitentiary." Vivian gasped, clutching her designer handbag against her chest. "You would not dare put your own parents in jail?" she whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "Try me," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Touch my son again, and you will find out exactly what I am capable of." I turned my back on them, completely dismissing their existence. I walked over to the front desk, thanked the officers for keeping my son safe, and signed the release paperwork. I took Malik by the hand, and we walked out of the police precinct together. I did not look back. I did not care how angry or humiliated my parents felt sitting in that lobby. They had played their hand poorly, and now they were terrified. They were realizing that I was not the obedient scapegoat daughter they could bully anymore. But the desperation was making them sloppy. And as we drove home, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail notification from my father. He was incredibly angry, and in his blind anger, he was about to give me exactly the evidence I needed to destroy their entire operation. By the time we arrived back at my house in Buckhead, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the driveway. I made sure Malik was completely settled. I ordered his favorite dinner and set him up in the living room with his video games. Despite the chaos at the police precinct, he was remarkably calm. I had spent the last 10 years teaching him that true strength does not come from yelling or throwing tantrums, but from staying composed when everyone else is losing their minds. He understood that my parents were not safe people, and he knew I would always protect him. Once I was certain he was completely fine, I walked into my home office and closed the heavy double doors. The room was quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of my computer monitors. I sat down in my leather chair and finally pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. There was a single new voicemail from my father, Clarence. I placed the phone flat on the center of my mahogany desk, took a deep breath, and pressed play on the speakerphone. The audio started with heavy breathing and the sound of a car door slamming. It was immediately clear that my father was furious. His voice boomed out of the small speaker, thick with rage and completely devoid of any parental affection. "You listen to me, Zuri." He started, his tone violently aggressive. "I have never been more humiliated in my entire life. You had your own mother and father treated like common street criminals today. You had police officers threatening us all because you want to play a power game with your sister. You have always been a bitter, jealous girl. You could never stand to see Jasmine happy, and now you are using her own flesh and blood to destroy her." I leaned back in my chair, my face completely expressionless. He was using the exact same gaslighting tactics he had used since I was a child. He wanted me to feel guilty. He wanted me to believe that protecting my son from an attempted kidnapping was somehow a malicious act of sibling rivalry. But I was not a helpless teenager anymore. I did not care about his approval. The voicemail continued, his voice rising in volume as he worked himself into a blind frenzy. "We are your family. You are supposed to help us when we are in trouble. Do you have any idea the amount of stress Trent is under right now? He provides a beautiful life for your sister, and you are actively trying to ruin it. You need to drop this ridiculous custody fight immediately." Then came the moment. The slip-up that happens when arrogant people lose their temper and forget to filter their words. My father was so consumed by his anger and his desperate need to put me in my place that he completely exposed their entire operation. "Give the boy back to your sister so she can get his money to save Trent Mansion," Clarence shouted into the phone, his voice cracking with desperation. "That trust fund belongs in this family. Trent has investors breathing down his neck, and the bank is threatening to foreclose on their estate by the end of the month. Jasmine needs that $18 million to save her marriage and secure their assets. You need to stop being selfish and hand the boy over so they can access those accounts. We need that cash, Suri. Do not make me come back over there and handle this myself." The line went dead with a sharp click. The heavy silence rushed back into my home office. I sat perfectly still, staring at the phone on my desk. I did not feel angry or hurt or betrayed. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of victory. I actually let out a low, quiet laugh that echoed in the empty room. My father, the man who spent my entire life calling me difficult and ungrateful, had just single-handedly handed me the most destructive piece of evidence possible. He had essentially recorded a full legal confession on my answering machine. He had explicitly stated that their pursuit of Malik was purely financially motivated. He had confirmed the exact dollar amount of the trust fund, and he had openly admitted that Trent was facing immediate bank foreclosure. He had just admitted to a conspiracy to commit financial fraud, using a minor child as the vehicle. They were so blinded by their greed and their ingrained belief that I would eventually submit to their authority that they became unbelievably sloppy. They thought family loyalty and traditional guilt would force me to delete the message and obey their demands. They thought they could bully me into handing over an $18 million trust fund to save a white man fake empire. I reached out and immediately downloaded the audio file. I did not just save it to my phone. I am a forensic accountant, and I know how easily digital evidence can be corrupted or lost. I exported the file to my encrypted secure cloud server. I made a copy on a physical flash drive, and I emailed the raw audio file to my personal attorney with a strict instruction to add it to our trial exhibits. This single voicemail dismantled their entire legal strategy. Jasmine's lawyer was planning to walk into family court and argue that Jasmine was a healed, loving mother, desperate to reunite with her lost son. They were planning to argue that Trent was a wealthy, stable father figure, ready to provide a superior life. But this 2-minute audio clip completely annihilated that narrative. It proved malicious intent. It proved financial desperation. And most importantly, it proved that Malik would be in immediate danger of financial exploitation if he was ever placed in their care. I looked up at my 3 computer monitors. The voicemail was the definitive proof of their motive, but now I needed the definitive proof of their crime. My father said the bank was threatening to foreclose on Trent Mansion by the end of the month. That meant Trent was actively hiding massive liabilities. I cracked my knuckles, pulled my keyboard closer, and opened my specialized financial tracing software. It was time to stop playing defense. The gloves were completely off. I was going back into Trent Kensington offshore accounts, his shell companies, and his missing investor funds. I was going to find every single dollar he had stolen, every line of credit he had defaulted on, and every tax document he had forged. I was going to build a paper trail so solid that it would not just lose them the custody case, it would send Trent straight to federal prison. The clock on my desk ticked past midnight, but I was wide awake. The soft blue light from my 3 massive computer monitors illuminated the dark office. I had a fresh cup of black coffee to my right, and my fingers were flying across the mechanical keyboard. This was my battlefield. Jasmine and Trent wanted to play games with family court, but they had no idea what a senior forensic accountant could actually do when she was fully motivated. I started with the public records. Trent always bragged about the Kensington family legacy, claiming he came from generations of Charleston old money. He used that narrative to belittle me, to make me feel like my self-made wealth was somehow inferior to his bloodline. I accessed the federal tax database and pulled the filings for the Kensington ancestral estate. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the first crack in his flawless facade. The grand estate in South Carolina was not owned outright. It had been remortgaged 3 separate times in the last 5 years. The final mortgage was held by a high-interest private lender known for dealing with high-risk clients. That was the imminent foreclosure my father had screamed about on the voicemail. Trent was paying exorbitant interest rates just to keep the lights on in a house he claimed his family had owned for a century. I dug deeper, shifting my focus to his investment firm. Trent presented himself as a genius portfolio manager for the ultra-wealthy. I ran his business identification numbers through a specialized tracking software that uncovers hidden corporate structures. A massive web of shell companies flooded my center monitor. He had set up over a dozen limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, using them to aggressively bounce money back and forth. In the financial world, we call this a shell game. It is a desperate tactic used to create the illusion of cash flow when a business is actually bleeding out. I traced the transactions line by line. I followed the money from the dummy corporations back to his primary business accounts. There was no generational wealth. The Kensington fortune had dried up decades ago, probably squandered by his grandfather. Trent was entirely self-funded, but instead of building a legitimate business, he was funding Jasmine's luxury lifestyle using client money. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. I saw wire transfers from his business accounts paying for Jasmine's expensive sports cars, her designer wardrobe, and their extravagant vacations to Europe. He was taking investments meant for retirement portfolios and using them to pay his massive credit card bills and maintain his fake aristocratic image on social media. The sheer scale of his fraud was staggering. I opened a new spreadsheet and began tallying his liabilities. I added the defaulted loans, the leveraged assets, the unpaid state taxes, and the missing client funds. When I hit the enter key, the final number flashed across the screen in bright red font. $12 million. Trent Kensington was $12 million in debt. He was not just broke. He was financially radioactive. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the number. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. The sudden intense desire to be a father to Malik after 10 years of total silence, the rush to family court, the aggressive mediation tactics, they were drowning. Trent investors were likely starting to ask questions about their missing money. If the bank foreclosed on the mansion, his entire fraud would be exposed, and the federal authorities would immediately start investigating his firm. They did not want Malik. They wanted Marcus. Or rather, they wanted the $18 million Marcus had left behind. They needed that trust fund to pay off the $12 million debt and still have enough left over to keep up their wealthy aesthetic. They were willing to rip a 10-year-old boy out of the only loving home he had ever known just to use him as a human ATM machine. A cold, predatory smile touched the corners of my mouth. Trent had stood in my driveway the night before, wearing a custom suit and looking down his nose at me. He had called my home an inadequate environment. He had threatened to ruin my reputation. He actually believed his white privilege and his fake last name made him untouchable. He was wrong. I highlighted the entire web of shell companies, the fraudulent tax returns, and the defaulted loan documents. I compiled everything into a massive encrypted digital folder. I categorized every single piece of evidence, cross-referencing it with federal financial regulations to make the case completely airtight. I was not just going to embarrass him in family court. I was going to hand the Federal Bureau of Investigation a perfectly wrapped gift. I saved the master file to my desktop and named it Checkmate. My parents and Jasmine thought they had backed me into a corner by trying to kidnap my son and forcing me out of my job. But all they had done was give me the quiet time I needed to completely dismantle their existence. The trap was fully set, and very soon they were going to walk right into it, blindly chasing the money that would ultimately destroy them. I stared at the $12 million debt on my screen, but the forensic accountant inside me knew the puzzle was not completely finished. Debt explains why they are desperate now, but it does not explain how they managed to maintain the illusion of wealth for the past 5 years. Banks stop lending when you default. So where was the fresh cash coming from to pay for Jasmine daily shopping sprees and Trent custom Tom Ford suits? I opened a new secure window and accessed the client registry for Trent Investment Firm. I pulled the transaction logs for the past 36 months. What I found made my blood run completely cold. Trent was not just a terrible businessman drowning in bad investments. He was a financial predator. I traced a series of outgoing wire transfers from his corporate accounts. The money was not going into high-yield bonds or mutual funds, like his sleek company prospectus promised. It was being funneled directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and then quietly wired back into his personal checking account in Charleston. But the truly sickening part was who he was stealing from. I looked at the names of the clients whose accounts were being drained. They were not corporate billionaires who could afford to take a loss. They were elderly couples relying on their retirement pensions. They were small business owners who had trusted him with their life savings. Trent was liquidating their retirement funds, forging quarterly statements to make it look like their portfolios were growing, and using the stolen cash to fund his wife's aesthetic. This was textbook wire fraud on a federal level. I wanted to see exactly how arrogant they really were, so I pulled out my phone and opened Jasmine's Instagram page. I placed it right next to my computer monitor and started cross-referencing the dates. On October 12th, Trent wired $45,000 from a retired school teacher pension account into his personal slush fund. 2 days later, on October 14th, Jasmine posted a photo of a brand new Rolex watch with the caption, "Hubby always treats his queen right. Blessed and highly favored." On February 3rd, Trent drained $80,000 from a widow life insurance payout. On February 7th, Jasmine posted a carousel of photos from a first-class trip to the Amalfi Coast, holding a glass of champagne on a private yacht. The caption read, "Old money aesthetics. Living my best life. Every single designer bag, every luxury car, every pair of red-bottom shoes she flaunted to make me and the rest of the world feel inferior was paid for by stolen money." Her entire identity was built on the broken backs of innocent working-class people. My parents had worshipped this man and shamed me for my honest hard work, while Trent was secretly committing federal felonies just to keep up appearances. In the United States, federal wire fraud carries a penalty of up to 20 years in prison for each individual count. Looking at the spreadsheet, I counted at least 40 separate illegal wire transfers. Trent was not just looking at a humiliating bankruptcy. He was looking at spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. And because Jasmine had enthusiastically signed joint tax returns and co-owned the dummy corporations, she was legally implicated as a co-conspirator. Their entire existence was an active crime scene. I spent the next 4 hours organizing the evidence. I did not just save it digitally. I needed a physical copy, something heavy and undeniable. I turned on my high-capacity office printer and let it run. Hundreds of pages of bank statements, wire transfer receipts, forged tax returns, and cross-referenced social media posts spilled into the tray. I gathered the thick stack of paper and bound it together perfectly aligned. I slid the massive stack into a heavy-duty legal folder. I took out a bright red label maker and typed out a single word: confidential. I pressed the sticker firmly onto the front cover. This was no longer just a family dispute over custody. This was a massive criminal enterprise. But I knew that if I just handed this to the local police, Trent expensive lawyers might find a way to stall or bury it using his fake legacy connections. I needed an entity that did not care about the Kensington name. I needed the federal government. I packed a secondary manila envelope with a duplicate set of the most damning wire transfer documents. I did not put my return address on it. I printed a generic shipping label addressed directly to the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in Atlanta. I slipped out of my house in the quiet early hours of the morning, driving to a 24-hour automated postal kiosk 2 towns over to drop the package in the bin. As I heard the heavy metal door of the drop box swing shut, a profound sense of peace washed over me. The sword was now perfectly sharpened and completely out of my hands. The federal agents would take a few days to process the anonymous tip, but once they saw the undeniable paper trail, the gears of the justice system would start grinding Trent into dust. When I walked back into my house, the morning light was streaming through the kitchen windows. I went upstairs and peeked into Malik's bedroom. He was sleeping peacefully, holding a book he had been reading the night before. He had no idea the kind of monsters that were trying to claim him. I gently closed his door. No one was ever going to use this boy to pay off their criminal debts. I walked into my bedroom and laid out my most professional power suit for the next day. Tomorrow was the final family court hearing where the judge would make a ruling on Malik custody and the trust fund. Jasmine and Trent thought they were walking into that courtroom to claim their $18 million prize. My parents thought they were about to secure their golden child future. They had no idea that I had already built their prison. They were going to walk into that courtroom at the absolute peak of their arrogance, and I was going to push them off the cliff. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse felt entirely different this morning. Yesterday they might have represented a battleground, but today they were the entrance to an execution chamber. I walked into the courtroom wearing a tailored navy blue power suit, my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely unreadable. My personal attorney sat beside me at the defense table arranging his legal pads, but he already knew his job today was mostly observational. I was the one holding the detonator. Across the aisle, sitting at the plaintiff table, was my family. They had clearly coordinated their outfits to present the ultimate image of affluent respectability. Jasmine was wearing a pristine, tailored white suit adorned with modest pearl earrings. She looked like the absolute picture of maternal innocence and purity. Trent sat right behind her in the gallery, wearing a conservative charcoal suit, looking like a strong, supportive patriarch. My parents, Clarence and Vivian, sat next to him, holding hands and looking at me with absolute disgust. Judge Davis, a stern older man with a reputation for having zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, took his seat at the bench. He adjusted his glasses and called the custody hearing to order. Jasmine, expensive attorney, a man named Mr. Harrington, immediately stood up and called his first witness to the stand. Jasmine stood up, smoothing her white skirt, and walked to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and sat down. Within 30 seconds of the first question, the performance began. Mrs. Kensington, can you tell the court what happened 10 years ago when your son Malik went to live with your sister? Mr. Harrington asked, his voice incredibly gentle and sympathetic. Jasmine took a deep, shaky breath. She looked down at her hands and let a single perfect tear roll down her cheek. I was so young, she began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. I had just given birth, and the biological father, Marcus, was completely absent. He provided no support, and I fell into a severe, paralyzing postpartum depression. I was terrified that I could not care for my baby properly. So I went to my older sister Zuri. I asked her to watch Malik just for a few weeks, so I could get the medical help I desperately needed. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement to keep my baby safe. She paused, dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue. I sat at my table watching her commit blatant perjury without blinking. She did not mention the smell of gin on her breath that night. She did not mention the first-class tickets to Milan with her wealthy new boyfriend. She simply erased her abandonment and replaced it with a tragic medical crisis. And what happened when you recovered and tried to bring Malik home? Mr. Harrington prompted, guiding her through the fabricated narrative. Jasmine let out a quiet, tragic sob. Zuri refused to give him back. She changed the locks on her house. She hired aggressive lawyers and threatened to have me arrested if I came near the property. I was a young, vulnerable mother with no money to fight a wealthy corporate accountant. She took advantage of my weakness and stole my child. And for 10 years she has systematically alienated my son from me, from his grandparents, and from his rightful family. I just want my baby back. I have healed. I have a stable, loving marriage, and I just want to be a mother to the boy I carried in my womb. The gallery was completely silent. My parents were nodding emphatically, wiping fake tears from their own eyes. Even Judge Davis softened his expression slightly, clearly moved by the raw emotion of a grieving mother. Jasmine was giving an Oscar-worthy performance, but I knew the exact dollar amount that was motivating those tears. $18 million can make anyone cry on command. Mr. Harrington paced in front of the witness box, letting the emotional weight of her testimony settle over the room. He then pivoted, launching directly into the character assassination they had prepared for me. Mrs. Kensington, you are now happily married to a successful financial advisor. You live in a spacious estate in Charleston, and you have the means to be a full-time stay-at-home mother. Is that correct? He asked. Yes. Jasmine nodded, looking bravely at the judge. Trent and I can provide Malik with everything he needs. A two-parent household, a father figure, an elite education, and a traditional family environment. And your sister Zuri Washington. Mr. Harrington continued, turning his body to look directly at me with absolute condescension. How would you describe her living situation and her ability to provide a standard traditional environment for a growing boy? Jasmine looked at me with a mixture of fake pity and deep concern. Zuri is a very ambitious woman. She is a senior corporate executive. She works 70 to 80 hours a week. She is unmarried, and she has no partner. Malik spends most of his time with paid nannies or at expensive boarding camps. He does not have a father figure in that house. Zuri is too obsessed with her career and her money to give him the emotional nurturing a child requires. It is not a healthy environment. It is cold, and it is lonely. Mr. Harrington turned back to the judge, leaning heavily on the sexist and classist microaggressions they had carefully woven into their argument. Your Honor, my client is not trying to diminish Miss Washington's financial success, but we all know that a massive bank account does not replace a mother love. A single unmarried woman working irregular corporate hours cannot provide the fundamental traditional stability that a 10-year-old boy desperately needs. Malik is approaching his formative teenage years. He needs a father. He needs the structure of a complete family. He belongs in a traditional home where he is the priority, not an afterthought squeezed in between corporate board meetings. The audacity of their argument was breathtaking. They were standing in a court of law arguing that my self-made wealth and my independence made me an unfit parent. They were arguing that Jasmine's proximity to a white wealthy man automatically made her superior, despite the fact that she had abandoned her child for a decade. They were weaponizing the concept of a traditional family to steal a child they only wanted for his hidden inheritance. My attorney leaned over and whispered into my ear, asking if I wanted him to object to the character attacks. I shook my head slightly, keeping my eyes locked on Jasmine. "Let them speak," I whispered back. "Let them dig the hole as deep as possible." Jasmine finished her testimony looking exhausted but triumphant. She stepped down from the witness box and walked back to her table, shooting me a quick, venomous smirk when the judge was not looking. She thought she had completely won the room. She thought she had painted me into a corner as a cold, bitter spinster who could never compete with her flawless marital aesthetic. Mr. Harrington confidently returned to his seat, organizing his notes. "Your Honor, we have 2 more witnesses to call who will corroborate everything my client just stated. I call Vivian Washington to the stand." My mother stood up, smoothing her expensive dress. She walked past me without even making eye contact, her chin held high with absolute arrogance. Jasmine had just laid the foundation of their massive lie, and now my own parents were stepping up to cement it. They were all participating in a coordinated attack to destroy my life. But as I rested my hand on the heavy leather briefcase sitting next to my chair, I felt absolutely no fear. They were currently standing at the absolute peak of their fake mountain, and the view was about to drop straight into the abyss. My mother placed her hand on the heavy leather-bound Bible. The bailiff asked if she swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. "I do," she said, her voice ringing with the practiced conviction of a woman who had spent 30 years serving on church committees. She sat down in the wooden chair, adjusting her posture to look as fragile and victimized as possible. Mr. Harrington approached the witness stand with a look of deep reverence. "Mrs. Washington, thank you for being here today. I know this is incredibly difficult for a mother to testify in a case involving her own daughters. Can you explain to the court the dynamic between Jasmine and Zuri growing up?" Vivian let out a heavy, sorrowful sigh. She looked at Judge Davis with the eyes of a wounded matriarch. "It breaks my heart to say this, but Zuri was always a deeply troubled child. She was intensely jealous of her younger sister. Jasmine was naturally warm, outgoing, and forgiving. Zuri was cold and calculating. She resented the attention Jasmine received. We tried everything to make Zuri feel loved, but she always pushed us away, choosing to isolate herself in her studies and her ambition. The lies flowed from her mouth like water. She was rewriting 35 years of emotional neglect in front of a federal judge, turning my survival mechanism into a character flaw. And how did this jealousy manifest when Jasmine had her son, Mr. Harrington, asked, leading her precisely where they needed the narrative to go? My mother gripped the edges of the witness box, her knuckles turning white to emphasize her fake distress. When Jasmine fell ill with postpartum depression, Zuri saw an opportunity. She did not take Malik in out of the goodness of her heart. She took him to hurt Jasmine. She knew that taking the baby would completely destroy her sister. And over the last 10 years, Zuri has subjected us to a campaign of profound emotional abuse. Mr. Harrington looked shocked for the benefit of the court. "Emotional abuse. Can you elaborate on that, Mrs. Washington? She alienated that sweet boy from us." Vivian cried, her voice cracking perfectly. "We bought him Christmas presents and birthday gifts every single year. We begged to see him. We stood on her porch knocking on the door, but Zuri would not let us in. She told Malik that we did not love him. She brainwashed my grandson into fearing his own biological family. Just a few days ago, my husband and I went to his school simply to drop off a gift, and Zuri had the police called on us. She stood in the precinct and threatened to throw us in jail just for trying to love our grandson." A collective gasp echoed from the few spectators in the gallery. Vivian wiped her eyes, turning to look at me with a perfectly crafted expression of maternal disappointment. She was committing perjury on the stand, lying under oath about gifts that were never bought and visits that were never attempted. She was twisting my fierce protection of my son into an act of unprovoked malicious cruelty. Thank you, Mrs. Washington. Your bravery in speaking the truth is commendable, Mr. Harrington said gently, guiding her off the stand. I call Clarence Washington to the stand. My father marched up to the witness box with the heavy, authoritative presence of a traditional patriarch. He swore on the Bible with a loud, booming voice projecting strength and moral superiority. Mr. Washington. Mr. Harrington began folding his hands in front of his chest. As the head of this family, how has Miss Washington's behavior affected your household? Clarence leaned forward, looking directly at the judge. Your Honor, this entire ordeal has been a nightmare. I raised my daughters to value family above all else. Jasmine and Trent have built a beautiful traditional home. Trent is a successful man, an honorable man who is fully prepared to raise Malik as his own son. But Zuri refuses to let go of her vendetta. She is using her corporate wealth to bully us. He pointed a thick finger at me, his face flushing with genuine anger. He was not acting anymore. He was genuinely furious that I dared to stand up to him. She is an angry, bitter woman, Your Honor. She works all hours of the night hunting down money while that boy is raised by strangers and nannies. She does not know how to be a mother. She only knows how to be an accountant. She is holding Malik hostage out of pure spite, and we are terrified for his psychological well-being. Judge Davis stopped writing. He slowly lowered his pen and looked at my father, then turned his gaze toward me. His brow furrowed into a deep, stern frown. The optics of the situation were heavily stacked against me. In the eyes of a traditional conservative judge, I was a high-powered single corporate woman who had allegedly weaponized my wealth to rip a child away from a tearful mother and a pair of heartbroken grandparents. The entire plaintiff table was practically glowing with an aura of victimhood and traditional family values. The scales of justice were visibly tipping. Jasmine and Trent shared a quick, triumphant look out of the corner of their eyes. They thought they had successfully boxed me into the stereotype of the aggressive, career-obsessed villain. Mr. Harrington turned to my attorney. Your witness, counselor. My lawyer leaned over his chair, groaning softly. They are lying through their teeth, Zuri. I need to get up there and cross-examine them. I can tear apart their timeline. I can ask for receipts for those supposed Christmas gifts. I placed my hand firmly over his notepad, pressing it down against the table. I did not break eye contact with my father, who was still sitting in the witness box, glaring at me with arrogant defiance. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible, but carrying absolute authority. Do not ask them a single question. My lawyer looked at me like I had lost my mind. Zuri, if we do not challenge this testimony, it enters the official record as undisputed fact. The judge is already looking at you like you are a monster. You are going to lose the custody battle right here. I turned my head slowly to look at my lawyer, my expression completely devoid of panic. Let it enter the record, I said coldly. Perjury is a felony. In order for them to be prosecuted for lying under oath, they have to completely lock in their statements. If you cross-examine them now, they might backpedal. Let them feel invincible. The lawyer swallowed hard, seeing the terrifying calculation in my eyes. He slowly stood up, buttoning his jacket. The defense has no questions for this witness, Your Honor. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Jasmine let out a small, audible scoff of victory. Trent leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs, looking like a king who had just conquered a new territory. Clarence stood up from the witness box, brushing off his suit jacket, and walked back to his seat with a self-satisfied smirk. They honestly believed I had given up. They thought the mountain of their lies was too massive for me to climb, so I was just surrendering. Judge Davis cleared his throat, looking at me with severe disapproval. Miss Washington, your counsel has declined to cross-examine the witnesses. The court has heard incredibly disturbing testimony regarding your conduct and your environment. Does the defense intend to call any witnesses to refute these claims, or are we moving straight to closing arguments? I slowly stood up, pushing my chair back. The scraping sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. I picked up the heavy legal folder with the red confidential sticker attached to the front. I did not look at Jasmine. I did not look at Trent. I looked straight at the judge holding the physical manifestation of their destruction in my hands. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, calm, and completely stripped of the emotional hysteria that had just dominated the room. I will not be calling any character witnesses today. Character can be fabricated, tears can be faked, and as we have just seen, family loyalty can be bought. I stepped out from behind the defense table and began to walk toward the bench. I do not deal in stories, Your Honor. I deal in numbers, I deal in paper trails, and I deal in the absolute indisputable facts of law. I have a submission for the court. A submission that will not only resolve the matter of custody, but will completely clarify the plaintiff's actual motivation for standing in your courtroom today. Before I could take another step toward the bench, Mr. Harrington suddenly jumped to his feet. He looked panicked, realizing that I was about to seize control of the courtroom narrative before he had finished his meticulously planned performance. Your Honor, I must apologize, Mr. Harrington interrupted, waving his hands frantically. The plaintiff has one final critical witness on the docket. We respectfully request to call Mr. Trent Kensington to the stand before the defense is allowed to present their closing evidence. Judge Davis frowned, looking from Mr. Harrington to me. He raised his hand, signaling for me to stop. Miss Washington, the plaintiff has the right to conclude their witness testimonies. Please return to your seat and hold your submission until they have rested their case. I did not argue. I simply nodded respectfully to the judge, turned around, and walked back to the defense table. I placed the heavy red confidential folder down in front of me and sat perfectly straight. Mr. Harrington had just unknowingly handed his client the shovel to dig his grave even deeper. I was more than happy to sit back and watch Trent Kensington bury himself alive. The bailiff called Trent to the stand. He stood up from the gallery, buttoning his tailored charcoal suit jacket, and walked down the center aisle with the casual, effortless arrogance of a man who believed the legal system existed solely to serve people who looked like him. He stepped into the witness box, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore his oath with a confident, booming voice. He sat down, crossing his right ankle over his left knee, looking completely at home in the center of attention. Mr. Harrington approached the stand, treating Trent with a level of deference that he had not shown to anyone else in the room. Mr. Kensington, thank you for being here. Could you please describe for the court the type of life you and your wife are prepared to offer Malik? Trent smiled, a perfectly practiced politician smile. Your Honor, I come from a family that deeply values tradition, legacy, and stability. We live in a historic estate in Charleston. Malik will have his own wing of the house. He will be enrolled in the finest preparatory academy in the state. He will have access to our private country clubs, our equestrian facilities, and a vast network of influential family friends. We are offering him a civilized, refined environment where he can grow into a successful young man surrounded by a complete, loving family. It was the ultimate old money pitch. He was using his white privilege and his fabricated wealth to paint an aesthetic of superiority. He wanted the judge to look at his suit, his skin color, and his zip code and automatically conclude that he was the better parent. And how would you contrast your home with the environment Malik currently resides in? Mr. Harrington asked, teeing up the final character assassination. Trent dropped his friendly smile and adopted a look of grave concern. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with absolute contempt. Your Honor, I have tried to be diplomatic with my sister-in-law, but the truth is, Zuri is a deeply troubled individual. She operates in a state of constant hostility. She is erratic, combative, and obsessed with control. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the railing of the witness box, using his deep, authoritative voice to command the room. Malik is currently living in an environment fueled by anger. Zuri is a corporate workaholic who compensates for her lack of a traditional family by buying the boy affection. but underneath the money, she is fundamentally unstable. She suffers from a psychological vendetta against my wife simply because Jasmine chose to live a traditional life. Zuri is an angry, bitter woman who has weaponized her bank account to hold this child hostage. There it was. He did not explicitly use the phrase angry black woman, but he hit every single coded dog whistle perfectly. He was leaning heavily into the racial and gendered stereotypes designed to make a conservative judge view me as a threat. He was painting himself as the calm, rational, wealthy savior, stepping in to rescue a child from a hysterical, hostile woman. Trent shook his head, acting as though my existence was a tragic burden he was forced to bear. Just days ago, she had her own elderly parents thrown out of a police station. She had my wife and me physically removed from her office building simply for trying to initiate a peaceful mediation. She is incapable of rational co-parenting. Her psychological state is actively detrimental to Malik development. Judge Davis was taking rapid notes, his expression growing darker by the second. Trent had successfully manipulated the narrative exactly the way he wanted. He had completely destroyed my character on the public record. But his toxic arrogance would not let him stop there. He felt so invincible sitting in that witness box that he decided to go for the ultimate prize. He decided to overplay his hand. Your Honor. Trent continued, his voice echoing loudly in the silent courtroom. Because of Miss Washington's erratic behavior and her clear psychological instability, my wife and I have grave concerns about her ability to manage Malik's future. A child cannot thrive when his guardian is emotionally compromised and prone to vindictive outbursts. Mr. Harrington nodded enthusiastically, prompting his client to deliver the final blow. And what is the plaintiff asking the court to do today, Mr. Kensington? Trent sat up perfectly straight, staring at the judge with absolute entitlement. We are asking the court to immediately terminate Zuri Washington guardianship. Furthermore, given my extensive professional background as a senior financial advisor, we are asking the court to immediately transfer all legal authority and financial management of Malik assets, including any existing trust funds, to my wife and myself. We need full control to protect the boy and his assets from a woman who is clearly unfit to manage either. The absolute audacity of his demand hung in the air. He had just walked into a federal courthouse, committed perjury, assassinated my character, and demanded the keys to an $18 million vault, all while secretly drowning in $12 million of criminal debt. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought his suit and his confidence made him untouchable. I sat at the defense table, my face completely blank. I did not glare at him. I did not shake my head. I simply let my hand rest gently on top of the red confidential folder. Thank you, Mr. Kensington. Mr. Harrington said, practically glowing with victory. He turned to my lawyer with a smug smile. Your witness. My lawyer looked at me, waiting for my signal. I gave him a barely perceptible shake of my head. The defense has no questions, Your Honor, my lawyer announced. Trent actually let out a quiet, arrogant chuckle from the witness stand. He shook his head as if he pitied my incompetence. He stood up, buttoned his jacket again, and walked back to his seat next to Jasmine. He put his arm around his wife, pulling her close. Jasmine leaned her head on his shoulder, looking at me with a triumphant, mocking smile. My parents sat behind them, letting out a collective sigh of relief. They had done it. They had painted the perfect picture. They had secured the money. Judge Davis set his pen down and folded his hands. Mr. Harrington, does the plaintiff rest? The plaintiff rests. Your Honor, Mr. Harrington said, sitting down and proudly straightening his tie. The courtroom fell dead silent. Everyone looked at me. The judge, the bailiff, the court reporter, and my treacherous family. They were all waiting to see how the angry, unstable woman would react to being completely destroyed on the stand. They expected me to start screaming, to object wildly, to prove every single stereotype Trent had just laid out. Judge Davis looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and stern authority. Miss Washington, he said, his voice echoing in the large room, the court is ready for your submission. You may approach the bench. I stood up. I did not rush. I picked up the heavy red folder and walked slowly across the courtroom floor. Every single eye was glued to my hands. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Trent and Jasmine were still smiling, but as I approached the bench, the sheer size of the folder in my hands seemed to finally register in their minds. I stopped right in front of the judge. I looked back at Trent. His arrogant smile flickered just for a fraction of a second. He had played his game. Now it was my turn to play mine. As I took my first step toward the bench holding the heavy red folder, Mr. Harrington suddenly cleared his throat loudly. He stepped out from behind the plaintiff table, raising his hand in a frantic gesture to interrupt me. He was desperate to get his final official demands on the record, sealing what he believed was an absolute, unbreakable victory before I could even hand my submission to the bailiff. Your Honor, if I may interject before the defense submits whatever desperate character references they have scraped together, Mr. Harrington said, his voice dripping with professional condescension. Given the severity of the psychological instability and the hostile environment we have just outlined, my clients cannot wait for a standard transition period. We are officially requesting an emergency court order compelling the immediate physical transfer of Malik into the custody of Jasmine and Trent Kensington within 24 hours. He paused, letting the weight of that aggressive timeline settle over the courtroom before delivering his ultimate demand. Furthermore, we request an immediate injunction granting Mr. Kensington full signatory authority over Malik financial assets and trust funds, effective by the close of business today. We must protect the boy and his estate from any further vindictive actions by Miss Washington. The sheer greed of his motion was palpable. 24 hours to uproot a 10-year-old boy life. Immediate access to the $18 million trust fund by the close of business. They were not even trying to hide the financial urgency anymore. They were wrapping their desperation in the guise of child protection, but the math was perfectly clear. They needed that cash before the banks closed on Friday. Judge Davis folded his hands, resting his chin on his knuckles. He looked over his reading glasses at Mr. Harrington and then shifted his gaze to the plaintiff table. He did not immediately rule, but his silence was interpreted by my family as absolute agreement. Jasmine was practically vibrating with excitement. She turned her head slightly to look at me and let out a soft, mocking scoff. A wide, victorious smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She thought it was over. She thought the judge was going to bang his gavel, send armed officers to my house to collect my son, and hand her husband a blank check for $18 million. She looked at me the way a queen looks at a defeated peasant. Next to her, Trent casually adjusted his silk tie, leaning back in his chair with supreme, absolute confidence. He crossed his legs, looking at me as if I were a minor inconvenience that had finally been swatted away. He had used his fabricated wealth and his old money aesthetic to manipulate a federal courtroom. He thought the legal system was designed to protect men like him and crush women like me. His chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic breath of a man who believed he had just successfully saved his fraudulent empire. In the gallery behind them, the reaction was even more sickening. I could actually hear my mother Vivian let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She reached over and squeezed my father's hand tightly. Clarence nodded, his chest puffed out in triumph, his face glowing with validation. They were whispering to each other, their eyes darting toward Trent with absolute reverence. They were probably already imagining the mortgage on Trent Mansion being paid off. They were imagining the country club dinners, the luxury vacations, and the return to their perfect fake aristocratic reality. They had sold out their own daughter and their own grandson for the promise of proximity to wealth, and in their minds the transaction was finally complete. The courtroom was heavy with the expectation of my total defeat. Mr. Harrington smiled smugly, waiting for the judge to grant the emergency order and dismiss my case. The bailiff stood nearby, ready to take my supposedly meaningless folder and file it away into obscurity. I did not panic. I did not flinch. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the courtroom. I slowly raised my hands and adjusted the lapels of my navy blue blazer, ensuring my posture was completely flawless. I let my eyes sweep across the plaintiff table, absorbing their foolish premature celebration. Arrogance is a highly dangerous drug. It blinds you to the reality of your own vulnerability. Jasmine, Trent, and my parents were so intoxicated by their perceived victory that they did not realize they were standing directly on a trapdoor. They thought they had built an impenetrable fortress of lies, using traditional family values and elite aesthetics as their shield. They thought my silence during their perjury was a sign of surrender. But as a forensic accountant, I know that silence is simply the space you create before you drop the hammer. I looked at Trent, taking in his smug smile and his expensive suit. I looked at Jasmine, taking in her fake tears and her white dress. I looked at my parents, taking in their profound betrayal. I committed their triumphant faces to memory because I knew this was the absolute last time any of them would ever smile in my presence. I turned my attention back to Judge Davis. I took the final steps, approaching the heavy wooden bench. I placed the red confidential folder on the ledge directly in front of the judge. My voice was calm, carrying easily through the silent room, completely devoid of any fear or hesitation. Your Honor, I completely agree with Mr. Harrington on one specific point, I said. The financial assets of this child are indeed in immediate and profound danger. However, the threat does not come from my home. It comes directly from the two people sitting at the plaintiff table. Mr. Harrington scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is grasping at straws, making baseless accusations because she has no factual defense against her own behavior. She is wasting the court time. Judge Davis held up a hand, silencing the lawyer. He looked intrigued by my complete lack of panic and the heavy red folder resting in front of him. I will allow it, Miss Washington, he said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You mentioned a submission. What exactly is in that folder? I stepped back, resting my hands at my sides. I looked directly at the judge, ready to tear their entire world apart. Your Honor, I said, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Mr. Harrington has spent the entire morning painting a vivid portrait for this court. He has presented my sister as a heartbroken victim of circumstance who simply wants her biological child returned to her. He has presented my parents as grieving grandparents, and he has presented Mr. Kensington as the wealthy, benevolent savior who is ready to take on the burden of a child he ignored for 10 years. They have asked this court to immediately terminate my guardianship and hand them full control over a minor child and his financial assets. I paused, letting my words echo in the high-ceilinged room. But I cannot contest Jasmine Kensington for the custody of Malik. I continued, my voice dropping into a register of absolute chilling certainty. I cannot fight her for guardianship today, because, Your Honor, legally speaking, there is no custody to contest. Mr. Harrington immediately shot up from his chair, practically knocking it over. Objection, Your Honor! He shouted, his face flushing red with frustration. What kind of ridiculous theatrical stunt is the defense pulling? We are literally in the middle of a custody hearing. Miss Washington is deliberately mocking the intelligence of this court because she knows she has lost on the merits of her character. I demand that she be sanctioned and this emergency order be granted immediately. Judge Davis did not look at Mr. Harrington. His eyes were entirely fixed on me, and then they slowly dropped to the thick red folder sitting on the polished wood of his bench. He had presided over family court for 20 years. He knew the difference between a desperate litigant grasping at straws and a professional who was holding a live grenade. He saw the cold, clinical lack of emotion in my eyes. He saw the posture of a woman who had already won the war before the first shot was even fired. Overruled, Mr. Harrington, the judge snapped, his voice sharp like a cracking whip. Sit down and remain silent until I have reviewed the submission. Mr. Harrington slowly sank back into his leather chair, his jaw clenched tight. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The smug, victorious smile that had been plastered on her face all morning began to waver. Trent crossed his arms over his chest, trying to maintain his aura of untouchable arrogance, but I could see the slight rigid tension in his shoulders. They did not know what was in the folder, but the absolute confidence with which I delivered it was starting to crack their psychological armor. Judge Davis reached out his hand, hovering over the red confidential label for a brief second before he flipped the heavy cover open. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning unit working in the background. I stood perfectly still, watching the judge face. The first document in the stack was the legal bombshell regarding Malik. It was the document that rendered this entire trial completely obsolete. I watched as Judge Davis' eyes scanned the top of the first page. At first, his expression was one of mild bureaucratic curiosity. But as his eyes moved down the page, absorbing the dates, the official state seals, and the notarized signatures, his entire demeanor underwent a radical, terrifying shift. The stern annoyance that had clouded his face during my family testimony vanished. The color seemed to completely drain from his cheeks, leaving him looking unusually pale. He read the first page again, as if his brain was refusing to process the sheer magnitude of the legal reality sitting in front of him. Then he slowly turned to the second page, then the third. The silence in the room stretched on, becoming incredibly heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a massive storm breaks. At the plaintiff table, Trent uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He looked at his lawyer silently, demanding to know what the judge was looking at. Mr. Harrington just shook his head, looking equally blind and panicked. Jasmine began picking nervously at her perfectly manicured fingernails, the facade of the poised elite mother rapidly dissolving into raw anxiety. Judge Davis finally stopped reading. He closed the folder, resting his hands flat on top of it. He took a deep breath, taking a moment to fully compose himself before he looked up. When his eyes finally met mine, there was no longer any pity or disapproval. There was only absolute stunned realization. He looked at me not as an angry black woman or an unfit guardian, but as a forensic accountant who had just orchestrated the most flawless legal ambush he had ever witnessed in his entire career. "Miss Washington," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, almost a whisper that carried through the tense room. He looked past me toward the plaintiff table where my sister and her husband were sitting in their expensive clothes, completely oblivious to the fact that their world had just ended. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional awe. "Do they have any idea that you have this?" "No, Your Honor," I replied, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any gloating. "They do not know. They never bothered to ask me. They simply assumed I was defenseless." Mr. Harrington could not take the suspense anymore. He slammed his hands down on his table and stood up. "Your Honor, I must object to this ex parte communication. The plaintiff has the absolute legal right to review any document submitted into evidence by the defense. Whatever fabricated paperwork Miss Washington has handed you, it cannot supersede my client's biological rights as a mother. We demand to see the file." Judge Davis slowly turned his gaze toward Mr. Harrington. The look the judge gave him was one of profound pity. It was the look you give a man who is standing on a train track aggressively arguing with the conductor while the freight train is entirely visible and moving at full speed right toward him. "Oh, you will see it," Counselor Judge Davis said, his voice suddenly turning incredibly cold and heavy with authority. "I assure you every single person at that table is going to see exactly what is in this folder. But I strongly suggest you sit down, Mr. Harrington, because your clients are about to have a very different day than the one they planned." The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He did not bang it loudly to clear the room. He simply tapped it once, a definitive hollow sound that signaled the absolute end of the games. "Miss Washington," the judge said, gesturing toward the center of the courtroom, "please step back to the defense table and utilize the projection screen. It is time for you to enter your evidence into the official record. Let us show the plaintiff exactly why they have absolutely no jurisdiction in this courtroom today." I gave the judge a brief, respectful nod. I turned around and began walking back to my seat. As I passed the plaintiff table, Jasmine stood up slightly, her eyes wide and frantic. "What is it, Zuri?" she hissed, abandoning all court decorum. "What did you give him? What are you doing?" I did not stop walking. I did not even look in her direction. I simply walked back to my attorney, who was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He quickly scrambled out of his chair to make room for me as I approached the laptop connected to the large courtroom monitors. My parents in the gallery behind the barrier were leaning forward as far as they physically could, their faces pale with sudden dread. The triumphant aesthetic they had built all morning was crumbling into dust. Trent was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was sitting completely rigid, staring at the screens mounted on the walls, as if they were execution orders. They had brought me into this courtroom to strip me of my dignity, my reputation, and my son. They had sworn on a Bible to destroy my life just so they could pay off their hidden debts. They had played the ultimate game of entitlement. I reached out and placed my hand on the computer mouse. The projector hummed to life, throwing a bright blue light across the dark wood paneling of the courtroom. I was not just going to defend myself, I was going to legally erase them. I clicked the mouse, opening the first document in the digital file directly onto the massive screens for everyone in the room to read. The bright white background of a scanned legal document filled the massive screens mounted on the courtroom walls. The harsh light reflected off the polished wood of the plaintiff table, illuminating the sudden confusion on my sister's face. At the very top of the document, printed in bold black lettering, was the official seal of the State of Georgia Family Court. I turned away from the screen and looked directly at Mr. Harrington, who was staring at the projection with his mouth slightly open. "You built your entire emergency motion on the premise that I am a rogue aunt holding a child hostage from his biological mother," I said, my voice carrying a lethal calm. "You stood in this courtroom and presented a tragic narrative of a young woman who only left her baby with me temporarily to seek medical treatment. You argued that her biological rights supersede my current guardianship." I clicked the computer mouse, zooming in on the bottom half of the projected document. The text expanded, filling the screens with undeniable legal absolute truth. "This is a voluntary surrender of parental rights and consent to adoption," I announced. "It is fully notarized, filed, and finalized by a federal judge, and it is dated exactly 8 years ago." A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. I could hear my mother let out a sharp, strangled breath, but I did not take my eyes off Jasmine. 8 years ago, Jasmine was not suffering from a medical crisis. I continued, speaking directly to Judge Davis, but making sure every word pierced the plaintiff table. She was frantically packing designer luggage for a 3-week luxury vacation to Milan with her brand new boyfriend, Trent. Malik had a severe double ear infection. He was running a dangerous fever. Jasmine did not want a sick, crying baby ruining her aesthetic European getaway. When I went to her apartment to pick him up, I brought a thick stack of paperwork. I told her I needed medical proxy forms to authorize his hospital treatments while she was out of the country. I clicked the mouse again, advancing to the next slide. A high-resolution close-up of the signature page appeared on the screens. Right on the dotted line under the bold heading of Irrevocable Surrender was Jasmine Kensington's signature. Her handwriting was perfectly clear, rushed, but unmistakable. Next to it was the official stamp of a licensed notary public. Jasmine was so desperate to leave, I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, absolute disgust. She was so obsessed with getting on that first-class flight and securing her wealthy man that she did not read a single page. She just kept asking me for a pen. She signed the medical proxies. She signed the liability waivers. And right in the middle of that stack, she enthusiastically signed away her own child. She abandoned him for a vacation, and she put her signature on it. Jasmine's face went completely pale. The elegant, poised mother act violently shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. She jumped up from her leather chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she pointed at the screens. "That is a lie!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the courtroom. "It is forged! I never signed that. I would never sign that. Zuri is lying." Judge Davis slammed his gavel down, demanding order, but Jasmine was completely hysterical. She grabbed Mr. Harrington by the arm, shaking him frantically. "Do something," she screamed at her lawyer. "Tell the judge it is a fake." But Mr. Harrington did not comfort her. He looked at the massive, high-definition projection of her signature, and then looked down at his own legal pads. He was a high-priced attorney who charged thousands of dollars an hour. He knew what a finalized adoption decree looked like. He knew the document was authentic, and he instantly realized the catastrophic magnitude of what his client had just done to his professional reputation. She had dragged him into federal court to file a fraudulent emergency custody motion for a child she had legally surrendered nearly a decade ago. Mr. Harrington physically pulled his arm away from Jasmine, taking a large, deliberate step away from her. He looked at Judge Davis, his face red with a mixture of profound embarrassment and furious anger. "Your Honor, my client never disclosed the existence of this document to me," he stammered rapidly, backpedaling to save his own license. I turned back to the judge, delivering the final, indisputable conclusion. A family court judge finalized this adoption 6 months after she signed those papers. I did not kidnap Malik. I did not manipulate the system. I legally adopted him. In the eyes of the law, Jasmine is nothing more than a biological donor. I am Malik's legal mother. Jasmine has absolutely no parental rights to terminate, and she has absolutely no legal standing in this courtroom today. Jasmine let out a sound that was half scream and half sob. She collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. The $18 million prize she had been chasing was instantly, permanently vaporized. If she was not the legal mother, she could not petition to control the trust fund. The money was completely out of her reach forever. I shifted my gaze to Trent. The arrogant, confident patriarch who had spent the entire morning demanding the keys to my son's financial estate was now sitting perfectly still. His skin had turned a sickly shade of ash gray. The realization of what this meant was hitting him like a physical blow. The trust fund was gone. The money to save his mansion was gone. His $12 million debt was suddenly crashing down on his shoulders, with no escape route in sight. He stared blankly at the screen, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He had tried to use his white privilege and his fabricated old money status to bully me into submission. He thought the legal system was his personal weapon. But he forgot that I am a forensic accountant. I do not bluff. I bring the receipts. But I was not finished. Destroying their custody case was only the first half of my submission. Jasmine had lost her fake maternal claim, but Trent was about to lose his freedom. I placed my hand back on the computer mouse, ready to drop the second bomb. But I was not finished. Destroying their custody case was only the first half of my submission. Jasmine had lost her fake maternal claim, but Trent was about to lose his freedom. I clicked the mouse one more time, and the screen shifted to a new document. This was not a family court record. It was a heavily redacted financial statement from a boutique investment firm, glowing in bright red ink. Trent Kensington, who had been leaning back in his chair, suddenly jolted as if he had been struck by lightning. His eyes widened in absolute terror as he recognized the numbers. They were the exact numbers he had used every sophisticated trick in the book to hide for the past 5 years. "Your Honor?" I continued, my voice echoing sharply across the room. The plaintiff spent the entire morning painting a picture of traditional upper-class wealth. Trent Kensington presented himself as a highly successful financial expert, ready to provide a civilized environment. But that entire persona is a massive lie. I used the laser pointer to circle the final bottom line on the projected statement. Trent Kensington is not a wealthy man. He is currently drowning in $12 million of debt. That historic Charleston estate he bragged about has been remortgaged 3 separate times, and the bank is officially initiating foreclosure proceedings at the end of this month. There is no generational wealth. His entire elite lifestyle has been funded by high-interest junk credit and money stolen directly from his clients' retirement accounts. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Mr. Harrington's jaw actually dropped. He turned to look at his client with a mix of professional horror and intense fury. A high-powered attorney knows exactly what happens when you represent a federal fraudster who lies under oath. Trent was completely pale, devoid of any color. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His hands shook violently against the table. The arrogant, condescending white patriarch had vanished, leaving behind a desperate criminal cornered by his own lies. Their true motive for standing in this courtroom today has absolutely nothing to do with maternal love or family values. I delivered the final crushing blow. They do not want to raise a 10-year-old boy. They are desperate for the $18 million left behind by Malik's biological father. They intended to use my son as a human ATM machine to pay off their fraudulent debts and save themselves from federal prison. My parents sat in the gallery completely paralyzed. Vivian clutched her chest, looking physically sick. Clarence shook his head, unable to process the numbers on the screen. The golden son-in-law they worshipped, the man they had used to demean my entire existence, was nothing but a broke con artist. The complete collapse of their scheme sent Jasmine into a blind, frantic panic. She could not accept that her flawless aesthetic and her luxury life were evaporating right in front of her. Greed entirely hijacked whatever rational thought she had left. She jumped up from her chair, completely abandoning her poised victim act. "But that is my son money!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me, her face twisted in pure rage. "Marcus was his father and I gave birth to him. I have a right to that payout. You cannot keep all $18 million for yourself, Zuri. The court has to give me my half. I need that money to maintain my life." The sheer audacity of her statement made Mr. Harrington physically step away from her, covering his face with his hand. She had just openly confessed to extortion in the middle of a federal courtroom, completely destroying any remaining shred of sympathy. Judge Davis had heard enough. The absolute disgust on his face was palpable. He swung his wooden gavel and slammed it down with a deafening crack that made Jasmine flinch and fall silent. "That is quite enough," Judge Davis roared, his voice vibrating with absolute authority. "Mrs. Kensington, you have absolutely no right to demand anything in my courtroom. You abandoned your parental rights 8 years ago, and you have just committed blatant perjury on my stand." The judge reached into the red folder I had provided and pulled out a certified document bearing the official seal of the state of Texas. He held it up high for the entire room to see. "And to completely, permanently end your delusions regarding this $18 million estate, I have the authenticated last will and testament of the deceased," Judge Davis announced. The will explicitly states that the entirety of the estate is placed into an irrevocable blind trust for the minor child Malik, and the sole individual appointed as the legal trustee with absolute financial control until the boy reaches the age of 25 is Miss Zuri Washington. Judge Davis glared down at Jasmine and Trent, his eyes cold as ice. "Even if you had miraculously won guardianship today, neither of you would ever have the legal authority to touch a single penny of this trust. The deceased locked every single door. Miss Washington controls the finances, and your fraudulent scheme has completely failed." The judge's words acted as the final executioner blade. Jasmine's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the courtroom floor, sobbing uncontrollably, not because she had lost her child, but because she had lost $18 million. Trent buried his face in his hands, trembling violently. He knew that without that money, the FBI would be knocking on his door before the week was over. My parents sat frozen in the gallery, their eyes blank and completely humiliated. Their elite facade, their fake traditional family, and their arrogant pride had been completely shattered into dust. The silence in the courtroom following Judge Davis' final declaration was absolute, but it only lasted for a few seconds before the reality of the situation completely fractured Jasmine's mind. She was still on her knees, staring at the wood floor, processing the fact that the $18 million safety net was permanently locked away from her. But then her eyes slowly drifted up toward the massive projection screens still displaying Trent's $12 million debt and the stolen pension funds. The pristine white aesthetic of her perfectly curated life shattered. She slowly stood up, turning to face the man she had abandoned her own flesh and blood to marry. Trent was backing away from the plaintiff table, his eyes darting frantically toward the courtroom exit. He was no longer the arrogant aristocrat. He was a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. Jasmine lunged at him, grabbing the lapels of his custom charcoal suit, her manicured nails dug into the expensive fabric. "You lied to me!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the room with a feral, hysterical pitch. "You told me you had old money. You told me the estate was paid off. You made me give up my son for you, and you do not even have a dime to your name." Trent tried to forcefully shove her away, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Get off of me, you stupid woman," he hissed, dropping every ounce of his refined southern charm. "You think those designer bags paid for themselves? You spent millions of dollars of my clients' money to look rich on the internet, and now we are both going to jail." The accusation pushed Jasmine completely over the edge. She raised her hand and slapped Trent across the face with such incredible force that the sound echoed like a gunshot in the high-ceilinged room. Trent stumbled backward, his cheek instantly turning a violent shade of crimson. He lunged back at her, grabbing her wrists as they began physically fighting right in the middle of the federal courtroom. They were tearing at each other's clothes, screaming vicious insults, exposing every single ugly truth of their fake marriage to the judge, the court reporter, and the gallery. The sophisticated elite facade was entirely stripped bare, revealing two greedy, desperate frauds fighting over the ashes of their ruined empire. Judge Davis hammered his gavel repeatedly, shouting for order, but the two of them were completely lost in their rage. Two heavy-set bailiffs immediately rushed the floor, grabbing Trent by the shoulders and forcefully ripping him away from Jasmine. They pinned his arms behind his back, while a third officer physically restrained Jasmine, who was kicking and thrashing wildly. Mr. Harrington, the high-priced lawyer, did not even try to intervene. He had already shoved his legal pads into his briefcase and was practically sprinting toward the side door, desperate to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of his client's crimes. Trent wrenched his shoulder, trying to shake off the bailiff. "I am leaving," he shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. "This custody hearing is over. Let me go." Judge Davis looked down at him with absolute contempt. "The custody hearing is indeed dismissed with prejudice," the judge announced coldly. "But you are not going anywhere, Mr. Kensington." Trent managed to yank his arm free. He shoved past his sobbing wife and bolted for the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. He thought he could outrun the consequences. He thought he could make it to his car and disappear. But just as his hand reached out to grasp the brass door handle, the heavy wooden doors violently burst open from the outside. Trent stumbled backward, nearly falling over his own feet. Standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit, were four federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across their chests. They stepped into the courtroom, moving with swift, precise, tactical authority. Trent Kensington, the lead agent, spoke, his voice cutting through the remaining chaos. He did not ask a question. It was a statement of absolute finality. Trent froze, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He looked back at me, standing calmly by the defense table, and then looked back at the agents. "I have a lawyer," he stammered, taking another step back. "You cannot do this. You do not know who my family is." The lead agent did not even blink. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt and stepped forward, grabbing Trent's arm and twisting it behind his back. "Trent Kensington, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and interstate financial crimes," the agent recited smoothly, slapping the cold metal tightly around Trent's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stood perfectly still, watching the metal lock engage. My forensic accounting had done exactly what it was designed to do. I had traced the hidden money, uncovered the stolen pensions, and built a paper trail so dense that Trent could not buy his way out of it. He was forcefully marched out of the courtroom, his head hung low in absolute disgrace. The fake aristocratic prince was on his way to a federal holding cell. With Trent dragged away, the courtroom suddenly felt hollow. Jasmine had collapsed back onto the floor, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. But my attention shifted to the gallery. My parents, Clarence and Vivian, had watched their entire golden reality disintegrate in a matter of minutes. The son-in-law they worshipped was a thief heading to prison. The daughter they favored was a broke co-conspirator. And the $18 million trust fund they desperately needed to maintain their social standing was completely untouchable. They realized they had backed the wrong horse. They realized I was the only person left in the room who actually had money, power, and control. Vivian scrambled out of the gallery, pushing her way through the swinging wooden gate. Clarence was right behind her, his face pale and sweating profusely. They rushed toward my table. Before I could even turn away, my mother threw herself onto the floor right at my feet. She grabbed the hem of my suit jacket, sobbing hysterically. "Zuri, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You have to help us. You have to pay Trent bail. If he goes to jail, the bank will take everything. Jasmine will be on the street. We will lose our house because we co-signed his business loans. You have the trust fund, Zuri. You have millions of dollars. Please save your sister. We are family. We are your flesh and blood." Clarence stood over her, his voice trembling with desperation. "Zuri, you made your point," he pleaded, holding his hands out to me. "You proved you are the smartest person in the room. Now please drop this vendetta. Help your family fix this mess. We need you." I looked down at the woman gripping my clothes and the man begging for my money. They had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. They had watched Jasmine drop a sick baby on my porch and told me it was my problem. They had gone to my son's school to kidnap him. They had sat in this very room less than an hour ago, placed their hands on a holy book, and swore to a judge that I was a bitter, abusive monster. They had tried to destroy me without a single ounce of hesitation, and now, because they had lost their fake white savior, they expected me to open my checkbook. I reached down and firmly peeled my mother's hands off my jacket. I stepped back, creating a physical and emotional distance that could never be crossed again. I looked my father directly in the eye, my face devoid of anger, sadness, or pity. It was completely blank. "You do not have a daughter named Zuri," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that chilled the air around us. "You chose your aesthetic over your grandson. You chose a con artist over your own blood. You sat on that stand and tried to ruin my life for a payout." Vivian reached out again, crying loudly. "We made a mistake, Zuri. We are sorry. Please do not turn your back on your parents." "I am not turning my back on my parents," I replied, adjusting my briefcase. "I am just acknowledging that from this exact moment forward, I do not have any." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on their screaming and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. I walked past Jasmine, who was still curled up on the floor. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the hallway. The sound of their desperate weeping was instantly cut off as the doors swung shut behind me. The case was officially closed, and the toxic cord tying me to that family was completely, permanently severed. I walked out of the Fulton County Courthouse and stopped at the top of the wide concrete steps. The heavy, oppressive air of the courtroom vanished entirely. The bright, warm Atlanta sun hit my face, washing over me like a baptism. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet taste of absolute victory. I reached into my bag, pulled out my designer sunglasses, and slid them on, shielding my eyes from the glare. I walked down the steps toward the street where my black Mercedes G-Wagon was parked waiting for me. I unlocked the doors and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life with a satisfying low rumble. I looked in the rearview mirror. Sitting in the back seat, completely safe and entirely untouched by the bloodbath that had just occurred, was my son. Malik looked up from his tablet, his bright eyes full of innocent joy. He smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reminded me exactly why I had fought so hard and so ruthlessly. "Mom, Zuri," he said, swinging his legs happily. "Are we done with the boring adult stuff now? Can we go get ice cream like you promised?" I looked at the boy who had saved my life just as much as I had saved his. I smiled back at him, the cold forensic accountant finally fading away, leaving only the fierce, protective mother in her place. "Yes, baby," I said, shifting the heavy SUV into drive. "We are completely done. We can go anywhere you want." I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, pulling away from the courthouse curb. I did not look back at the building. I did not look back at the wreckage of the people who had tried to break me. I drove forward onto the open, sunlit highway, leaving the toxic past completely burned to ash behind us, heading straight toward a brilliant, unburdened future that was entirely and wonderfully ours. The greatest lesson from this entire ordeal is that blood does not automatically make someone family, and sharing a last name does not entitle anyone to your peace. For years, my parents and my sister tried to diminish my worth because my success threatened their fake aesthetic. They tried to use traditional guilt to manipulate me into absolute submission. But when you build your own independence and you know your true value, you become completely untouchable. True family is about the people who protect your peace, not the ones who try to sell it. Never be afraid to walk away from toxic bloodlines to protect your own future. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace, let me know in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our community of strong, independent women.